Asia-Pacific Conference on the Resilience of Democracy, 21st Century Solutions for the 21st Century Challenges to Democracy. I'd say this is a pretty timely topic to be having at a time when there's rising populist movements, a sort of eroding trust in politicians, and centralization of power. At a time like this, it's important to look back and maybe think about resilience and how resilient democracy actually can be. So, looking forward to some interesting and intensive discussion today and some great outcomes out of the labs later on today. Without further ado, let's kick off with some speeches. So we'll have some welcome remarks by the Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, Dr. Paikesoti Saravanamuthu.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Policy Alternatives, it is indeed my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this launch of the Resilience of Democracy, the International Idea work, Resilience of Democracy with regard to the Asia-Pacific region. Let me place on record my indeed pleasure of working with DRI and International IDEA in terms of making this conference happen. Needless to say, the issue of the resilience of democracy is a particularly pertinent and apposite one in the world that we live in today, and particularly important in respect of the Asia-Pacific region, which is, after all, the region of the world which has the largest proportion of the global population. In a sense, the future of democracy, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, depends in large measure on the extent to which it takes hold in terms of the institutions and processes of government and governance in our part of the world, but most importantly too, in terms of the popular culture which will animate and give purpose and direction to those institutions and processes. At the moment, I think we face a number of challenges in this respect, from problems with regard to ethnicity, religious tensions, but more importantly as well, across the board, I think we have a major issue with corruption, which, like a cancer, corrodes the faith of people in the institutions of democracy and in politics and politicians. We also have questions with regard to elections. We also have questions with regard to the participation of women in politics. And I'm glad that in the course of these 2 days, we will be looking much more closely at these issues and see what the particular challenges are as far as these issues are concerned in the Asia-Pacific region. These are welcoming remarks, so I won't go much further, apart from saying welcome to everyone and to wish us all very fruitful and meaningful deliberations on this important topic. I think what we need to recognize and understand is that democracy, its future as a system of government and governance, and I emphasize this, is in our hands, rests on our shoulders in terms of its future. And so we need to better understand what the challenges are and indeed how to disseminate its promise amongst our peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saravanamuthu. We will now call Ms. Leena Rikila Tamang, the Regional Director for International IDEA in the Asia and Pacific region, to give an introductory speech.
All our distinguished invitees from Asia-Pacific region, from all the way from Fiji to neighboring countries in this region, commissioners, MPs, directors, and all distinguished participants, Sri Lankan civil society, media, academics, and colleagues and friends. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to this invitation, and thank you to CPA and DRI for collaboration in organizing this conference here in Colombo, Sri Lanka. We are very pleased to be able to use this occasion to discuss some of the findings of our Global State of Democracy report, International Ideas Signature publication, which is providing a kind of a health check of democracy worldwide. Recent media reports, some public opinion polls around the world are warning about the apparent growing threats to democracy, suggesting that democracy may be in decline. And there are certainly reasons to be concerned. Headlines announce crises related to corruption, elections, security, increasing role of organized crime in politics. And others worry about the erosion of some of the democratic safeguards in many countries, perhaps also in this part of the world. So is democracy in decline? Our answer is no, or at least not yet. When looking at democracy globally and over time, the picture is in fact rather positive. We see that since 1975, over the last 40 years, democracy has made considerable advances around the world. And while the progress has slowed down since the 90s, and we do see worrying developments, this doesn't yet indicate that democracy is declining or regressing at the global level. On the contrary, democracy has proven to be rather resilient, able to recover from the crises and events of backsliding. Obviously, there are regional, sub-regional differences between countries and even within the countries. And perhaps Asia and the Pacific region is particularly diverse also in this regard. Many more are also asking the questions whether democracy can deliver in terms of welfare and services, and how can democracy counter growing inequalities in a globalizing world. So we are not saying that democracy by any means is an answer to all ills, or that democracy is resilient by default. But what we are interested in is to try to understand what is it that makes democracies resilient, and how that can be strengthened. What can we do? What can you do? And indeed, if there is one main message from this report, it is that we should not take democracy for granted. Our aim with this report is to renew public debate about democracy, and also to inspire action to build, safeguard, and strengthen democracy. The second message is that we need to be sensitive to new types of challenges, what we call modern democratic backsliding, opposed to traditional coups or fraud on the particular election day. These modern backsliders, as we call, getting power through the channels of democracy, through free and fair elections, tend to manipulate rather than abolish democratic institutions and mechanisms, and use the law to reduce the space for civic space and political freedoms. We see a number of governments extending their mandates through constitutional amendments, or increasing concentration of executive branches, undermining the independence of judiciary, or limiting political freedoms and media restrictions. With this, they claim certain degree of legitimacy. However, and this is where the hope lies as well, there is always leaving a seat for civil society and others to challenge that backsliding. And what we also found is that the democratic backsliding doesn't weaken people's will or people's ideal of democracy, and how they view and value democracy seem to be, in fact, strengthened in the face of such threats. But building resilient democracies and preventing backsliding relies on active citizens and institutions. And improving that resilience begins with establishing people's trust on these institutions and the effectiveness of democratic politics. Today, I would like to recognize the presence of our two State of Democracy ambassadors, Dr. S.Y. Qureshi, the former Chief Election Commissioner of India and a member of our Board of Advisors, and Ms. Didi Anggraini, leading civil society activist, election expert from Indonesia. We have also with us Professor Peter de Souza, who was the member of the editorial review board of this publication and will address us tomorrow. And I'm particularly glad that we are organizing this here in Sri Lanka, a country which has gone through a ravaging, traumatizing civil war, witnessed upturns and downturns in its own democracy. And a global research, and also our report, often mentions Sri Lanka or refers to Sri Lanka as an example of democracy's resilience, citing its apparent capacity to recover from and cope with democratic backsliding events. And we hope that this report will motivate Sri Lankans on this path. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Saku, for organizing this with us. And thank you all very, very much.
Thank you for those comments. Can I now call upon Dr. Sakuntala Kadirgama, the country representative of Democracy Reporting International, to make some remarks.
Members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished participants, distinguished members of the election commissions, academia and civil society, on behalf of Democracy Reporting International, a co-sponsor of the Asia-Pacific Conference on the Resilience of Democracy, seeking 21st century solutions to 21st century challenges to democracy, I would like to add my welcome to you. Welcome to Sri Lanka, and welcome to be a part of this useful and fruitful discussion. Democracy Reporting International, or more simply referred to as DRI, is a non-partisan, independent, and not-for-profit organization, and it promotes political participation of citizens, accountability of state bodies, and the development of democratic institutions worldwide. And DRI helps to support local ways of promoting the universal rights of citizens to participate in the political life of their country. In Sri Lanka, we work to accompany Sri Lanka's democratic transition, supporting key stakeholders, including lawmakers and civil society, by providing comparative expertise on constitutional reforms and supporting government commitments to strengthen compliance with international human rights standards. So discussing issues of the resilience of democracy, it comes to the heart of DRI's mission and mandate, and I was delighted when IDEA invited us to participate in this program along with the Center for Policy Alternatives. From a personal stance, it gives me great pleasure to work with IDEA and CPA, as we've had a long personal association with these two institutions. There will be much to say in the course of the discussion, and I too have some caveats to add at the beginning of the proceedings. There is a rather optimistic ring to this program, Resilience of Democracy. Is it a slogan, rather like love conquers all? Or is this a wish or a hope or an assertion of fact? Can we be utterly sanguine about the resilience of democracy, that it will finally prevail? I think Lena was quite upfront about this, saying, yes, we can't take it for granted. It has to be nurtured and supported. And while I too am firmly within this community of believers in democracy, I think we have to be watchful, vigilant, and critically engaged at all times. There was an optimism about the benefits of globalization, but today I think there is a rethink on this and greater protection on national borders. Former bastions of liberal democracy have adopted other isms, nationalism, populism, ethnocentrism among them. They believe in democracy for us, but not for them or the others within their midst. Hard-won human rights standards that served as global norms for decades are now questioned as unnecessary impediments. We live in a world where there has been a lot of democratic backsliding, and as Lena said, they don't come in the form of upfront challenges like coups or revolutions, but they are like cancers that creep on a healthy body. These trends have eroded democratic values and commitments, and thus have altered societies that see themselves as fundamentally democratic. Even where democracy does conquer all eventually, and the public may pull a country away from the brink, there is no doubt that this backsliding impacts on democratic institutions and cultures. It takes a while to recover from erosion, and perhaps what will emerge is a mutated form of democracy. In the 21st century, technology has changed the ways we work, live our lives, the way we are governed, and even the way we fight wars. We engage with one another in different ways. We organize and communicate in different ways. On the one hand, virtual communities replace physical communities. On the other hand, vast swathes of people are left further behind and are bewildered by these changes. There are positive as well as negative aspects to these changes. We can access information at great speed. We can mobilize for positive ends, for example, organize disaster relief or mobilize youth to challenge existing social structures or political structures. But we can also spew hate speech with impunity and relative anonymity and catalyze conflict in a more surreptitious way. Some of the challenges are indeed 21st century challenges, such as the 21st century difficulties of protecting the nation state, where there is no certainty as to what constitutes a nation or what are the boundaries protecting the state. States may be attacked not through a violation of their boundaries, but through other means. There are also old challenges draped in 21st century garments. Corruption, manipulation of voters, abuse of power, all of which have been referred to by Sarah and Lena. These go back to days of old, but the scale in which they have occurred have a greater possibility of destabilizing the states, regions, and even have a wider international impact. The elections of January 2015 in Sri Lanka are often hailed as a triumph of democracy, when a candidate with few resources at hand was able to defeat a powerful incumbent with a vast party machinery and state resources to draw on. Nevertheless, mobilizing to push a president out has proved easier than mobilizing to address more difficult issues such as war crimes, corruption, and recasting the democratic framework through wide-ranging constitutional reforms. I'm sure many of the participants will have their own experiences to share and challenges that they have faced and the gains that they've made, and also, alas, of opportunities lost. Once again, we look forward to the presentation of this report and to a very interactive discussion. And again, welcome to Sri Lanka and welcome to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kadirgama, for those remarks. We are now coming to the real meat of the discussion. So we're now going to have a presentation of the Global State of Democracy report, exploring democracy's resilience. We're going to kick off with a presentation by Rumbitsai Kandaswika Nundu, the Senior Program Manager of International IDEA. She's going to present the global and regional trends and key findings.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, colleagues from our cooperating partners, our member of the Advisory Board of International IDEA, honorable members that I at least recognize from the Kingdom of Bhutan, because we've had an opportunity to do some work together. May I say, all protocol observed. On behalf of International IDEA, and indeed on my behalf, under the guidance of our Director for Asia Pacific, Ms. Lena, I would just like to give you a walk through our production for the year. We call it our production for the year because of the efforts that we invested in it. And some of the aspects that I'm going to build on are very much in sync with what Sanku and Lena have already said, especially in terms of the messages. I want to believe that all of us have had sight of the overview of the publication, and maybe you can then follow up in the details in terms of some of the issues that I will raise and the key messages. But I'm also delighted to know that, to get some feedback that others have already started reading and they find the publication to resonate with the realities in our different contexts. First of all, just to explain that this is the very first edition that we are doing as International IDEA. And it's so much premised in the understanding that as International IDEA, we believe that democracy is homegrown. It comes from within, and it's also driven by the principle that we hold of non-prescriptive democracy, because we know that each country will go through different phases and there will be elements. Maybe it's like a mixed bag. That's why even our theme, when others are saying, prophesying things of doom, that is, democracy is not working as International IDEA, we are seeing some milestones in the ability for democracy to be resilient. So if we look at the publication, which we hope maybe most of you will be able to see the full publication, we are highlighting global and regional trends and challenges. And Lena has already alluded to the issue of our approach, that we need to look at providing policy recommendations, but these policy recommendations are indeed driven by IDEA's understanding of a broad definition of democracy, which is non-prescriptive. The publication also presents some useful data from the Global State of Democracy indices. This speaks to the different attributes that we are seeing in different democratic contexts, and how they are able to deal with the pushback and the backsliding that could occur, because we do acknowledge that in some elements and in some contexts, there have indeed been some backsliding. At the same time, the publication highlights the enabling conditions for democracy's resilience and the impact that also democratic backsliding has on the quality of democracy. And it shows the key challenges. And some of those key challenges to democracy, they are essentially what form the core content of the various chapters that we have, because the publication has got 8 chapters, and those 8 chapters are essentially speaking to the key challenges that we are acknowledging. But as we are acknowledging those key challenges, we are also highlighting the ability and the trends that we see globally in terms of how democracy has been able to respond to those challenges. You will recall that Lena mentioned mentioned the key messages, and indeed, being the fact that democracy is at a crossroads. And what we have been doing overall is to look at the democracy trends since 1975 to 2015. But once democracy is at a crossroads, we've also realized that globally there's been some aspects of progress in the various democratic context. And it's not like everything is backsliding, it's not like there's stagnation. The need for democracy and demand for democracy, we still find that it's quite high among the citizens. That's why you'll find that one of the chapters of the publication engages and addresses the issues of citizens' engagement. And we notice that at the country and regional level, in the last 5 to 10 years, we see that threats to democracy have also had responses that ensure that democracy's threats cannot continue without having anything to mitigate against the loss that will emanate if democracy is not safeguarded. At the end of the day, we totally believe that democracy cannot be taken for granted. It must be protected and safeguarded. And I'm sure you'll see from the film that we are going to screen, where one of the participants is talking about democracy as a garden that you need to water, that you need to weed, that you need to attend to, because you cannot take it for granted. And that's also among one of our key messages in the publication. The second message deals with the issue of democratic backsliding, that indeed where there's democratic backsliding, it's not weakening people's ideal of democracy. The public views and perceptions and expectations for democracy is actually strengthened in the face of such threats. And I think we've seen, for instance, if I can just give one of the examples, what we saw happening within the Arab Spring, where there was literally an uprising, a very coordinated and a very protracted demand for democracy. And we are seeing milestones and changes in countries, for instance, such as Tunisia. And as International IDEA, we do have presence and work in Tunisia. And we can see the gains that have actually emanated from the demand for democracy. And Lina also alluded to the fact about modern democratic backsliding when leaders manipulate systems. In one of the discussions that we have been having around the publication, one of the issues that has come out is what is it that people need to do when undemocratic political parties or undemocratic leaders are elected through democratic means, because then when they are in those spaces where we expect them to deliver on democracy and be the champions for democracy, they then use the democratic systems in order to manipulate it for their own personal gains and their continued stay in power. And I can cite several examples from the African continent, for instance, because at least I'm well vested in that, where we've seen presidents manipulating and wanting to change national constitutions so that they can extend their stay in power or their term limits, which is exactly an example of modern democratic backsliding, because the countries would have come up with very good national constitutions, but then later on, when the leaders are in power, they use the democratic systems in order to take away the democratic gains that people had and were constitutionally established in terms of democratically, in terms of term limits for presidential leadership. So the first chapter of the publication is really giving us the global state of democracy, an overview from 1975 to 2015. And one of the key issues that we are looking at really is to deal with some of the attributes that we see. The attributes that we see in a democratic context, whereby, sorry, I've gone too fast, whereby democracy, at the end of the day, there are threats that that occur, but at the end of the day, you see attributes such as representative government, you see checks on government, you see participatory engagement, you see even the demands for social rights and equality increasing, even though generally the context is not very enabling. So our first chapter of the publication is speaking to those general attributes of democracy and why it has, and these link up with the democracy, with the data indices that we have come up with to validate the fact that while democracy is under threat, it is still also very resilient because of all those elements, whether it's to do with how access to justice, whether it's to deal with how elected governments function. Even if the democratic system, or even if the political systems can be repressive, more and more people are demanding their democratic rights that speak to most of those issues that we have tried to give in that illustrative example. And this essentially covers some of the aspects that I've just highlighted. And maybe to note the fact that opportunities, especially for participatory engagement, have generally gained ground over the period of time from 1975 to 2015. And whereas fundamental rights might seem like there is a backslide, you can see from the different data indices that we have that more and more people are demanding their rights, more and more people are demanding the opportunities to participate. And the opportunities also in forms of participation are also changing, especially in view of the use of ICTs and enhanced social media platforms. We have these trends. I'm sure you will see some dips across, which this gives regional trends in terms of how it has, how democracy has been progressing. And generally, you can see that in certain times, maybe around 2000 and 2005, there were major dips in the different regions. But at the end of the day, we see that the trend it's not like it's just flat or it's totally going down. There are ups and downs, and I think these trends that we are highlighting show the reality on the ground, because democracy is not static, and at the end of the day, democracy is not a goal in itself, because it's a process. So different processes keep occurring and different events keep occurring that might threaten it, but also there is also responses that then strengthen democracy. And this is why our theme is really about how resilient democracy is. The second chapter, because we focus so much on the notion of democracy resilience, we felt that it's important to give a meaning and interpretation of what it is that we are saying. Why are we saying democracy is resilient in a changing world? And we have identified these key characteristics that we can actually say on the basis of data or knowledge-based information. We can say that democracy's resilience has been proven by its ability to recover from the threats and its flexibility and the innovation and adaptation. These are key characteristics that we are seeing in validating and justification and justifying the theme and the conceptual understanding that democracy has been resilient. Democracy remains resilient. And as a result, we see that what is it that happens when democracy is under pressure? We see when there's backsliding, we see also the call and demand for accountability. Like, for instance, the example that I've given of manipulation of constitutional provisions. When that is happening, it's not like the citizens are just sitting back and watching political leaders manipulating the constitutions. They are also demanding for accountability. They are also demanding for inclusion. They are also questioning and demanding, putting checks and balances on the systems, so that everything that is done in the name of democracy by leaders really speaks to the needs of the people. And one of the issues that we have also identified, for instance, in many parts of the world currently, is the issue of migration, how it has really challenged and threatened, become maybe a major pressure on democracy, and the extent to which countries are able to deal with the high inflow and issue of migration across the different countries. Chapter 3, threats from within, democracy's resilience to backsliding. I think for us this is a very fundamental chapter, because it really deals with the issue that a lot of other publications and also a lot of other assessments have been zeroing in, to the extent of getting people to feel that they can give up and democracy has really backslided. This, in a way, looks at so much as how people have become the important agents for change. It has also shown us that the modern backsliding, whilst it can be seen to be on the rise, it has not allowed people, that has not caused people to give up, and that has not caused people to sit back and watch, but indeed it has given people the opportunity to organize and mobilize and demand for their democratic rights. Chapter 4 is the one that deals with political parties and participation, and this is also very central to democracy building in terms of looking at how political parties are key conduits or institutions that can support democracy building. But at the end of the day, we have seen that there's a lot of mistrust and lack of trust in political parties. And what is it that political parties need to do in order to adapt, in order to be responsive, in order also to restore the citizens' sense of inclusion, and also at the same time respond to the rising challenge of populism. At the end of the day, we are still arguing within the publication that even if political parties are encountering several threats and sometimes political parties are seen as not responding to the people's needs. Any democratic context will need some functional political parties. And the publication shows that if political parties can and will be able to deliver on the results, deliver on their promises, because this is one of the things that kept coming up, that political parties do not deliver on their election promises. And when they campaign, people only see them when it's time for the next election. And in the publication, we are giving a lot of policy recommendations and highlighting the approaches that political parties can adopt in order to remain resilient and also to remain functioning and operational and relevant in the democratic sphere. The 5th chapter is the one that also raises a lot of issues on money in politics. And it really explores the influence of money and how corrupt money can actually capture democracy, and what is it that needs to be done in order to protect democracy. We give some challenges that we see, whereby big money, illicit money coming from different sources can result in creating an unlevel playing field. And in the publication, we are showing that this unlevel playing field, it's not just political parties, but we've really given it a very strong perspective on the gender dimension. How, for instance, the inequalities between women and men with regards to access to political financing or funding for their campaign creates a lot of inequalities in the democratic sphere. And that's why, for instance, we end up with a lower number of participation and representation of women and men in positions of power and decision-making at all levels. At the same time, we've also realized that countries across the world, they are putting in place measures to regulate and control the issue of money in politics. What is it that is required in order to make sure that we keep corrupt money out of the political sphere? Our analysis of the money in politics issue really centers around those 4 aspects. You know, the public officials, the political parties and candidates, what they do, the oversight actors, the donors, because also the money that flows in from different donors, it is what we can call, it has some strings attached. Others, it's used to secure government tenders, to secure business with governments. But at the end of the day, we are emphasizing, the publication is emphasizing the need for regulated flow of money in politics in a way that allows and can create an enabling playing field. And the publication shows that if these aspects that deal with what happens to public officials, to what extent are they corrupt-free or even working to eradicate corruption, and also what happens to the funding that goes to political parties, where is the accountability and transparency that relates to the funding that political parties and candidates receive, and also the oversight actors, to what extent are they able to then call candidates or to call political parties to account for the money that they have received. And obviously, the donors, the ones that provide that money, what is their role? If we put that in totality, the essence is really to say, if we have an enhanced system and integrity in the political systems, this will in a very big way help to curb the influence of money in politics, especially illicit money that comes into the political field and naturally results in an unlevel playing field, not just between political parties, but also between women and men in the different contexts and in the different countries. Chapter 6 deals with the issue of inequality. And this is what the chapter we are calling Mind the Gap. to what extent can democracy counter inequality? We realize and we acknowledge that inequality within countries is at a historic high, particularly among the young people, where you find that most of the youthful populations across the world, they are not employed, they don't have any access to resources, economic resources, and inequality as an issue really challenges and undermines democracy resilience. So the need for the redistribution of power and privileges is essential. We acknowledge also the fact that democracy does not automatically reduce inequality, but the state is the most efficient means, but we understand that if a state is pursuing policies to address inequalities, it becomes an efficient means for inclusive democracy, for inclusive development. This chapter relates so much to the issue that we are always trying to grapple with and address within international idea, whether democracy can deliver on development or development can deliver on democracy, and how these two should not be taken as separate, standalone issues, but that they reinforce each other and need to be looked at and addressed in a very synchronized way. Because we cannot say we are going to develop first and then democracy will come, or we say we get democracy first and then development will come. People and the expectations of the citizens, which is something that we highlight in the publication, is that they expect the two to go hand in hand. Democracy, like ordinary people will ask, okay, what will democracy give me? Can I have food? Can I have a job? Can I be able to send my children to school? Can I pay for my access to health? All those kind of things. And therefore, we highlight within the publication that in a democratic context where democracy is resilient, you find that the aim and the intention is for inclusive development that also reinforces and buttresses the democratic context and the democratic sphere. I will move to the chapter 7, and then chapter 7 is really underlying the issue that I have already mentioned, the one on migration, social polarization, citizenship, and multiculturalism. We have seen in the past years that migration flows have increased, especially from countries, people coming from Africa trying to go, for instance, to Europe. And this has, in a way, become very central to the work that we are doing as International IDEA in terms of how democracies can respond to issues of migration, to issues of multiculturalism, to issues of diversity. And it is very clear that from the data that we got and also from the analysis that we have done, that countries with inclusive integration policies are associated with a high quality of democracy. Maybe just to cite from a personal experience, I can say this really resonates with me when I look at a country like, for instance, like Sweden, where their inclusive integration policies said to be more open, and I think most of us are aware the extent to which Sweden was receiving migrants from Syria due to the conflict. It's one of those countries that received a lot of migrants from Syria due to the conflict that is taking place in Syria. And the publication is arguing that inclusive political integration mechanisms, like, for instance, granting voting rights and providing opportunities for political participation, are key to building democracy and promoting democracy resilience, even though the issue of migration is very political, and to a very large extent in some countries, it has also been met with resistance and with a rise of populism, where populist parties, they now campaign on the issue of being on anti-migration policies or anti-friendly or user-friendly migration policies. The last but not least chapter, which is chapter 8, is really looking at inclusive peace building in conflict-affected states. and the design for democracy's resilience. At the end of the day, we are highlighting the fact that an inclusive, nationally owned and open transition processes produce more resilient democracies. And I think this is very key and resonates so much with maybe most of us in this room in terms of what our countries have gone through and the processes that have been undertaken in order to ensure and facilitate inclusion and inclusive processes, such as constitution building processes that have taken place in Myanmar, in Nepal, and as International IDEA, we have directly engaged in that process, and also political settlements and design of electoral systems. Because at the end of the day, the inclusive processes in post-conflict and reconstruction and post-conflict rebuilding context that we are proposing are not one-dimensional. I think you will see that we are even mentioning constitutions, political settlements, and electoral processes, because we believe that any situation that has to respond to the issue of conflict in the post-conflict process, in the post-conflict reconstruction context, needs to undertake the different processes in a multidimensional way in order to combine the efforts and in order to combine the outputs that or outcomes that are expected from that process. At the end of the publication, we now have the global indices. And what is important about the indices is that it can be used to evaluate the state of democracy at the global, regional, and national or country levels. So each country can be able to shows the scores, the different scores, and depicts the democratic trends for each country. So you can take, for instance, look at the publication and look at the indices, like for what's pertaining to Sri Lanka, what's pertaining to Nepal, what's pertaining to Bhutan, in terms of the different global attributes that I mentioned only earlier on that were in a illustrative, in a secular illustrative diagram. And all of these, the democratic attributes that we are looking at, they are grounded in, as I have said earlier on, IDEA's definition of democracy, which is not a linear process, and it is not just about one aspect, and it's not about ranking countries, but it's about acknowledging the milestones and the progress that each country goes through, whether it's through constitution building, whether it's through electoral systems design, whether it's through multi-party development and inclusion, whether it's through how the media operates. So all those aspects, and citizens' engagement, for instance. So all those democratic attributes on participation, on access to justice, you can, using the indices that we have provided, be able to get like an overview of where your country stands, or where the neighboring country stands, or where the region stands. But ultimately, the purpose is not to rank and give numbers to countries, but it's to acknowledge what each and every country is able to do. And the indices, like I've already said, this is now just to sum up, they are based on those attributes which we have highlighted. So we hope that you find it useful and it can relate to the aspects that you are grappling with in your different capacities, whether from civil society, whether from parliaments, whether from the executive, whether from the judiciary. We hope each country will be able to reflect and take stock, but at the end of the day, be encouraged by the fact that democracy is still resilient, and democracy is actually the chosen form of governance by most citizens across the country, across the world, no matter what the pushback and backlash would appear to be. Thank you, honorable and distinguished delegates, for your attention. I think I'll stop here and allow us to discuss further.
Thank you, Rumbitsai, for that insightful commentary. We'll now call on Dr. Qureshi, the former Chief Election Commissioner of India, to make some reflections on the findings.
Distinguished participants, and the organizers. I'm indeed very privileged to be here to share some of my experiences and views on the topic of today. As a member of the board, we had several rounds of discussion on indexes of democracy, because many exist. There are at least a dozen. In fact, I was doing a research study on democracy in South Asia, initially South and Southeast Asia, but reduced to South Asia, and we came across exactly 12 indexes: Freedom in the World, Democracy Index of EIU, Economist, Unified Democracy Scores, World Press Freedom Index, Electoral Integrity Project, etc., etc. There was a lot of debate in our board. Why do we need another? And why we decided to go in for this, despite the constraint that we have, which all others did not have. A media person can write what he wants, a professor can write what he wants to see, but as an inter-country organization, as Lena had said, and my other colleague said, we cannot be prescriptive. We have to be very, very careful. We cannot be judgmental, and still have to underscore the problem that we face. And the last sentence of Rumbidzai was that we have to help each country reflect and be encouraged to take action. That was the purpose why we took up this study. Lena suggested that I focus on a bit on India and a bit on South Asia. And one interesting thing is that 30% of the world's democracy lives in these 8 countries. Disproportionately high the presence of democracy, and that's why probably the global attention should be also proportionate, which is not the case at the moment. And if you include Southeast Asia, it is 60%. Now 16 countries, which is 8% of the world number of countries out of 203. If they have 60% of the world's democracy, we need to focus on this. And that focus has indeed increased as far as the international idea is concerned. Lena particularly, I must give the public credit to her, that ever since she took over at Canberra, she has really activized Asia-Pacific region. Otherwise, we were very generally Europe-centric, with a little bit of interest in Africa. In India, when I was doing I wrote a book. I wish I had brought a couple of copies to present to the host here. It's called An Undocumented Wonder: The Making of the Great Indian Election. If you look up Amazon, you'll find it. Now, when I was doing that study, I came across a reference to India's democracy being flawed. My initial reaction was of anger and annoyance. Oh, one of those usual Western conspiracies to have parameters which will show us down and show them up and things like that. But when I looked at the index, this was the Economist index, I found the reason why we were classified not as a full democracy but as a flawed democracy were exactly the same concerns which we were expressing on a daily basis. The money power, lack of women in parliament, illiteracy. So what was the problem with them? So we have to actually, instead of quarreling with these studies, it's better to focus on reforms, what we can do, the corrective action. And we feel we need to do that. There are so many things which you can do anytime. Innovation is something. Innovation is one keyword which my colleague had used. Also an adaptation, which we need to do. And I would like to give you just one example of an innovation combined with adaptation. When I took over at the CEC, I gave myself 2 challenges. One, money power, that I'll go after it and try and finish it. Second, voter apathy. Voter turnout in many places, particularly in metros and in urban areas, used to be 25%, 30%. The contradiction was that the so-called educated people not only did not vote, but they used to brag about it. Oh, I've never voted in my life. Instead of hiding their face, they were bragging about it. We decided we will change it forever. We'll make them hide their face. We'll make them run for cover. We'll embarrass them. We'll name them, shame them. And we started a voter education program which did exactly that. After that, every election in the last 10 years has given us historic turnouts. Now, one interesting innovation which we did was introduction of National Voters' Day. The reason was that we found the youth, and you will find in this book reference to lack of participation of youth. That was our problem as well. 18 to 20 years segment were only about 12%. Why are they not interested in democracy? We wanted to know. So we did knowledge, attitude, behavior and practice surveys through professional agencies to find out why they are indifferent. And mainly three reasons. One, many did not know that 18 years is an age when they become eligible to vote. Second, they did not know what to do. Even if they are eligible, where to go, what is the process, what is the procedure, where is the office, they knew nothing. So both these things mean we have to give them education, voter education. And the third was, we were very serious, their contempt for politicians. And that also was referred to in the presentation so far. Unfortunately, the reputation of the politicians worldwide is extremely low. The moment a speaker says that all politicians are corrupt and thieves, you get the loudest applause, which is a sad situation, which is a pity, which is dangerous, because you can't love democracy and hate politicians. Without politicians, there is no democracy. You have to work with them, you have to deal with them. And sadly, there are some paradoxes of democracy, one of which is that this bad image of politicians is the creation of nobody else except themselves. The way, for instance, in India, I'm very embarrassed to say, I'm asked this question and I have no answer. We have one of the greatest democracies. 33% of MPs have criminal cases pending against them. And many against some of them, there are many cases and of serious, heinous nature. Now, what to do? Now, this also points out another paradox of democracy. A good election is essential for democracy, but is not necessarily a guarantor of good democracy. Through a very good election, even in The Economist, we got 9.7 out of 10 for democracy, for conducting elections. But for other indicators like corruption in government, for various other factors, our scores were a bit lower, which dragged us a little back. Now, a very good election, but a criminal, because he is not debarred from contesting, he contests, he wins, what can you do? And people who do not know, they blame the election commission. Look, you guys are useless, you are toothless, you can't keep these guys out. They don't realize it's not in our hands, it is with Parliament. So, another paradox which I see is that a stable democracy, is it a good thing for democracy? Sometimes the stable democracies lead to authoritarianism. One politician in India, Mayawati, was on record saying that she likes instability because her party of the backwards, the untouchables, the downtrodden came to power only because of the instability. If one party comes to power with solid numbers, they have a tendency to be authoritarian. Day before yesterday, I was in Nepal after observing elections. And we see that one party is coming with absolute majority, not needing even the alliance partner. Even without the alliance partner, they can form the government and powerful government. Already some people are commenting that this is dangerous for them. Although they are supporters of the same party, but they are scared. They feel that the biggest internal check to democracy is kind of a balance between ruling party and the opposition party. Another paradox which I see that democracy is not just election or election commission, it is various other institutions also, including judiciary. Now in India, the judiciary, I call Indian judiciary a guardian angel of our democracy. But in Pakistan, they threw out an elected prime minister. Now would you call it a good thing or a bad thing? Is it a positive, good role of the judiciary? What army did in 99, the judiciary did now, same thing, throughout an elected government, elected prime minister. So what do you do? We were that was the time when the world was celebrating. We were all commenting that it's the first time ever that Pakistan has a situation when an elected government has been replaced by another elected government. But what happened? Therefore, a balance of power between these institutions becomes very important. Now, finally, what are the emerging concerns in the entire South Asian region? One, of course, we need constitutional, legal, and administrative reforms. We need to strengthen the institutional capacity, independence, and integrity of election management bodies. When the integrity of the election management body is questioned, the elections themselves come into question. We have the example of Bangladesh, we have the example of Pakistan, but Nepal Election Commission is regarded very highly, Bhutan is regarded highly, India of course extremely respected, which is why we get away with lots of things. If our credibility was low, everything will be suspect. Then we need constitutional, legal and administrative reforms to constantly to keep improving democracy. We have to deal with the challenge of voter participation. Now, I was talking of youth, another dimension of youth. I was attending one civil society meeting somewhere in the eastern India, when somebody from the audience raised his hand and said that 18 years is an age to celebrate. I said, that sounds like a good statement. Let us think of a celebration. Within a week, we came up with the biggest program of youth empowerment in the world. And what was that? We started looking for those who will become 18 on 1st of January, which is the qualifying date, beforehand, 3 months before. By the time 1st of January came, we had already got them on our rolls. On the 5th of January, the first available opportunity, we notified the roll throughout the country. And on 25th January, we decided we will celebrate that day every year as National Voters' Day. First, we thought we'll call it Young Voters' Day or a New Voters' Day, but we decided we'll call it National Voters' Day. Why that date? Because that was the day when the Election Commission of India was born. And it was born a day before India was born as a republic. That shows the importance Constitution framers gave. Now, on that occasion, we organized 800,000 functions, public functions, to give these new voters their voter card. I wrote a letter to the Cabinet Secretary that in October, that on 25th January, we'll celebrate National Voters' Day. Please, and we'll organize 800,000 functions. Please ask the ministries and the state to extend necessary cooperation. It was more of a courtesy letter. 3.5 months gone. On 19th of January, just 6 days before my National Voters' Day, I get a call from the Cabinet Secretary. Qureshi, your proposal for the National Voters' Day is coming before the Union Cabinet today. My heart sank. Proposal, damn it, I've already done it. It's all there. It's all organized. So what if they reject it? Where will I be? And we have 2 questions which you have to answer. So what are the questions? Would you want a national holiday? Thank God I didn't want a national holiday. He says, how much money do you need? I said, nothing. He said, what are you saying? I said, not a rupee. He said, what are you saying? Are you mad? You said you are going to organize 800,000 functions. How would you do that? I said, registering voters is my job anyway. I'm just converting it into an event. Something which I do around the year. That is the adaptation, madam, which you are using. That is how we adapted. The registration is our job. We spend money throughout the year, convert it into an event. Event always creates an impact. That is how we will do it. This must be the approval of a union cabinet proposal on 8-line letter. Otherwise, it's a long procedure where 20 ministries are consulted and this and the notes and profile. Nothing of the sort, because it was so simple, doable. So now, which is why we have to keep our mind open to new ideas and keep implementing them. Now, abuse of incumbency is one common issue. Election expenditure and financing is something which is a chapter in itself, and International IDEA has been focusing on it for a long time. In fact, in 2015, I discussed with the Secretary General that we have been talking of money power in elections infinitely for years, but let us focus on its solutions. Because I have personally attended many conferences, this conference is discussing the same thing, next conference is discussing the same thing. Why don't we have a sequential thing that we take up where we left in the last conference and dedicate 2015 to finding solutions? And we had 3-4 conferences, the last one being in December 2015 in New Delhi, where we came up with New Delhi Declaration, which has 2 parts. One is underlying principles of political finance. Second, model guidelines, so that instead of reinventing the wheel, you have the same problem as I have. So why don't you learn from my experience? So that was the idea. And now we have to promote the concept of the decisions of New Delhi Declaration. Finally, from all the common issues that we find, that there is still so much in common, we have to do a lot of hand-holding and experience sharing among the Asian countries ourselves. And I would suggest the universities and academic institutions particularly to focus on this. Finally, I would just comment on Churchill's most famous statement that democracy is the worst form of government after all others have been tried. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those comments, Dr. Qureshi. Anybody has any questions? Now would be the time.
Hi, Ju Chong Tam from the Law School at University of Melbourne. I think that's also a wonderful publication, and I think really such an important resource for people committed to democracy. Just really a question made in a critical spirit of democracy. It seems to me that much of the focus is a national focus, and I think that's rightly so. But I suppose my question is this, whether some of the problems that we are encountering are really transnational in their nature. And the particular example, my area of expertise, which is looking at money in politics, we see 2 examples in terms of perhaps things of transnational challenges. One is the influence of foreign governments into domestic politics, which that occurs across a number of countries. The second example really about the influence of powerful multinational companies in particular industries, again in a range of countries. And so this question is offered in the spirit that perhaps this actually could be a basis of transnational solidarity.
Today we have time only for a couple of immediate reactions. Then after, in tomorrow morning, we had a dedicated time for thorough Q&A on the findings and the indices and all that. But if there are indeed other immediate question or comments regarding Tam's observation, Rumbitsai, you may have a proper answer to this, but from my perspective, what I find from the indices is that we can extract information at the global level or the data global level, regional level or sub-regional level. Oceania is one region. Asia Pacific, you can create indices on Asia Pacific and at the national level. So all these levels are there indeed. We are not actually trying to avoid the too much of a focus at the national level, particularly recognizing this nature of transnational nature of these threats to democracy. But then we were kind of forced to include it because there's so much of demand and questions. What about my country? What's happening in my country? Hence, it is possible, but the emphasis really is at the regional, global, regional, sub-regional trends that we try to detect.
Lina has just laid it out very clearly, but just to say that the reason why there's an aspect of the national illustration is because everything we call global is a totality of things that happen in national context. When we say the global world, when we say, this is regional or sub-regional, it's a totality of what happens in national context. And in order to have that knowledge-based and validated global outlook, you need to illustrate it with the country or national context, and then be able to say, if this is happening, for instance, in 10 out of 15 countries in a particular region, it gives you a regional trend, and you can then put that together, collect that together now at an international and global level, and be able to say, if this is what is happening in the different sub-regions because of what is happening in the national context, it gives you this global perspective. So we are indeed acknowledging the fact that these issues are not just national or country-centric, but they are issues that are cross-cutting and are influenced by other dimensions that manifest themselves at an international or at a global level, and we see the two interconnecting. So your point is very valid, and we hope, as Lina has said, in reading more, you'll see that even in the beginning of each chapter, we try and give the global outlook and the influence of multi-dimensional issues across the regions and the forces that can be there, and illustrate how then it does affect what is happening in national context or country context. But we do appreciate that feedback, and it's essential. Maybe in the next publication, we can see how to build on enhancing those aspects that you have also highlighted. Thank you. Those are my reflections. Dr. Kurashi, would you? Thank you.
Maybe I can follow up question to you. Thank you. You kept saying a couple of times that there is nothing prescriptive about defining democracies, but I don't feel that's correct, because certain things, rule of law, franchise, equality, you cannot have a democracy without prescribing these things.
Thank you. I think the essence of being non-prescriptive comes from an international idea, not going to a particular country and saying you have to have this. What you are saying are values and principles that are fundamental and are foundations that we propagate and say, if in a country context to be democracy, some of these elements need to be visible, need to be there. But we understand that it's not going to happen in every country at the same pace, and also in a linear way, because this is a process, because the end goal, democracy is a process. You can't say we've done elections, like you rightly say, good elections, and therefore we are democratic, because they are multidimensional issues. But as an institution, we don't take an approach whereby we believe we can pronounce and make a judgment that if your elections are fine, but still you are struggling with the issue of corruption, therefore you are written off as a democratic state, because there are different aspects that contribute to a country being democratic. And for us, what you have said are values and principles that we believe need to be nurtured, need to be supported, and they happen and grow and progress differently in different contexts, depending on each particular country's history, vision, and current future. That's the reflections that I can provide at the moment.
I am Lizerio Diaz. Maybe I am the youngest one in this room. So I see that today you mentioned that the role of youth is important to strengthen the democracy. So I'm very interested that I'm here to learn and share some of my experience. The presentation of report today is very interesting to remind us to improve some things and maintain some good things. I would like to recommend some interesting point and make some comments. I would like to comment on how we can strengthen democracy through the education process. As we know, we talk on democracy, it's about, for me, it's about people's behavior, people's principle on how to preserve some idea. In some proverb say that it's very easy to build a big building with 10 or 11 floor rather than to educate one people. So in my recommendation, can we see the possibility to introduce the democracy as a curriculum in all schools, mainly in the elementary school and in junior high school and senior high school, so that the youth and the child can start to understand already the good values of democracy. So when they are growing and they become the leader and the state actors in the future, the good value of democracy is already in their principle, and they can use this to develop others, because it's all relating to people understanding people principle and people behavior. I'm looking forward to hearing some feedbacks from you. Thank you very much.
Can we take the other question as well? And I'm afraid that's all the time we'll have for questions. And
mine is more technical. When you consider immigration, did you think about internally displaced people, prolonged displacement? Because they also lose their voters' rights. So maybe in this study, I don't see IDPs being mentioned. Maybe that's something that we need to consider. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your comment on education. I think we all say information is power. So that's a very valid and essential approach, because if we entrench the values, teach a child at an early age, it will form them and it will shape them, and also give them a certain mindset and perspective to life. You've raised the issue about internally displaced people, and I want to admit that it's not outlined and articulated in as much detail as maybe you would have expected. But of course, it's referenced in the report, because in some contexts we realize that before people decide to leave the country, maybe they stay internally, but they are not staying where they call their home place, but they have to take refuge somewhere, but still within the same country. But as you rightly say, we probably did not give it a very, focused attention, and we take note of that. But also realizing that the facts, we were also looking at aspects that we can speak to on the basis of the data that we were developing, because we needed to make sure we have the data and the indices, to build the indices that speak to these trends and challenges. And at the moment, as International IDEA, we had not yet built that data that speaks to the issue of internally displaced people. So we acknowledge that it's not as highlighted as maybe it should be. Thanks.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions, but you can certainly discuss during the break.
The challenge for me of always having to prove myself that I can do it. I can do it as a black person. I can do it as a woman in my own country.
Bei meinen Eltern konnte man sehen, dass in den nächsten 20 Jahren da nichts passieren wird. Überhaupt nie was passieren wird bis zum letzten Tag. Und das war der Grund für mich, für meine Flucht.
The regime had the monopoly on media. I knew that people were dying. I had to talk about that. They were not telling the truth.
Democracy is not like the Andeans, that it's there forever. It's like a garden that you have to water every day.
So democracy doesn't happen by chance. It's shaped by small and big actions that each and every one of us contribute. And thank you all, Lena, Rumpitsai, Dr. Kurasi, for these incredibly interesting insights in the previous session. Now it's time for all of you to engage actively and to take action. And what I will do now is to walk you through very briefly on what exactly we will do in the Ideathon Labs for the rest of the day. So we'll talk about what we will do, how we will do it, and with whom. And this essentially comes down to three things. First, what we want to do is to take all these important policy recommendations that are included in the Global State of Democracy report and put them into practice. Essentially, we want, through the Ideathon Labs, we are looking into finding ways, creative and innovative ways of operationalizing the policy recommendations that are included in the report. Second, we want to inspire others around the world with these ideas. As you know, this event and the Ideathon Labs is part of a series of global events. We held similar Ideathon Labs in other parts of the world, such as in Stockholm, in Amsterdam, in Benin, in Peru. And this is the Ideathon Labs that will take place for the Asia and the Pacific region. And third, we want to connect you with other interesting people working on issues related to democracy in the Asian Pacific region, who might also be thinking the same issues as you are, or who might give you some new food for thought. How we will be doing this? For this, we put together a methodology which is called Ideathon. It is similar along the lines of a hackathon. And what does it mean? It's basically a focus group discussion. So we will break out into 3 different groups, and we will discuss 3 topics, focusing on 3 chapters of the publication. The first one will focus on the topic of democracy's resilience to backsliding. And we can see the questions, the specific questions that will be addressed in each of the labs. The second one will focus on the topic of money in politics, and the third one on the issue of inclusive peace building in conflict-affected states. So here you see the specific questions that we will address in each of the labs. The lab discussions will be guided by a template that is already in the rooms where the breakout sessions will take place. And you will, even if you haven't read the overview or the publication yet, you will also find the printed copies of the policy recommendations for each of the issues that will be discussed. And who? Each lab should ideally result in one project idea and/or opportunities for collaboration, which either you, the participants, can implement directly after walking out of this event, or you think others could and should implement. At tomorrow's plenary session, we will present the project ideas that will result from the lab discussions. And in the coming weeks, we at International IDEA, we will edit them and we will publish them online on International IDEA's website so that they can be used as inspiration by others. And on International IDEA's website, we will also publish all the project ideas and recommendations that have resulted from all the lab discussions that took place until now in the other events as well. Who will be involved in the labs? Each lab should have a minimum of 8 and a maximum of 15 participants, and this is why we have requested you to register your names at the entrance. For those of you who haven't done yet, please, before walking into the breakout session rooms, please register your names to make sure that there is no lab that exceeds the maximum number of participants. And the moderators, lab number 1 on democratic backsliding will be moderated by my colleague Rumbitsai. Lab number 2 on money in politics will be moderated by my colleague Adi. And lab number 3 on inclusive peace building by myself. To conclude, I just want to give you a very brief on the housekeeping. First of all, the labs should be under the Chatham House rules, and that means that there is one basic rule. We give no attribution of statements. We can talk about the lab, we can tweet about the lab, we can take what happened in the lab and what has been discussed in the lab and publish it or talk about it, but we cannot say who said what, especially. The cameras will be in and out the breakout rooms, and they will record a few images, but there will be no sound. So maybe just a few images from the discussion. And finally, you can bring your laptops, your iPhones, your iPads, whatever you want, whatever gadget you want. But the only thing that we would encourage you is to take this as an intellectual exercise, where for just a few hours, you disconnect a bit from the outside world and you try to connect with this amazing group of people that you have here today. I wish you all a very fruitful discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing your ideas tomorrow at the plenary. So here you see again the questions, and good luck. For the rooms, the first lab on democratic backsliding will be in this corridor on the left side in room number 3. The second lab on money in politics will be in room number 4, and the third lab on inclusive peace building will be in the best room that this hotel has on the ground floor. And when I say the best room, I mean it.